Okay, 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 okay. I'm studying the Bible in Toronto. 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 Studying the Bible with Mike and Pat. These other YouTubers are just so trash. Hit the thumbs up if you wanna support. Go follow Mike as he follows the Lord. I'm studying the Bible in Toronto. 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 You better watch out, Mike's calling out the shields. If you're not free grace, you need to sit down and chill. We're not hyper grace, you know we keep it real. Eternally secure, you know that we're sealed. We don't back low, we're not workspace heretics. Mike's not in it for the money, trying to get a lick. They out here selling their souls for a couple clicks. Becoming Freemasons so they can't just get rich. I'm studying the Bible in Toronto. 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 Shout out to Mike and Pat. Check out his channel, Toronto Bible Study. Subscribe and like.
The same day went Jesus out of the house and sat by the seaside, and great multitudes were gathered together unto him, so that he went into a ship and sat, and the whole multitude stood on the shore. And he spake many things unto them in parables, saying, Behold, a sower went forth to sow. And when he sowed, some seeds fell by the wayside, and the fowls came and devoured them up. Some fell upon stony places, where they had not much earth, and forthwith they sprung up, because they had no deepness of earth, and when the sun was up they were scorched, and because they had no root they withered away. And some fell among thorns, and the thorns sprung up and choked them. But other fell into good ground, and brought forth fruit, some 100-fold, some 60-fold, some 30-fold. Who hath ears to hear, let him hear. And the disciples came and said unto him, Why speakest thou unto them in parables? He answered and said unto them, Because it is given unto you to know the mysteries of the kingdom of heaven, but to them it is not given. For whosoever hath, to him shall be given, and he shall have more abundance. But whosoever hath not, from him shall be taken away even that he hath. Therefore speak I to them in parables, because they, seeing, see not, and hearing, they hear not, neither do they understand. And in them is fulfilled the prophecy of Isaiah, which saith, By hearing ye shall hear, and shall not understand, and seeing ye shall see, and shall not perceive. For this people's heart is waxed gross, and their ears are dull of hearing, and their eyes they have closed, lest at any time they should see with their eyes, and hear with their ears, and should understand with their heart, and should be converted, and I should heal them. But blessed are your eyes, for they see, and your ears, for they hear. For verily I say unto you, that many prophets and righteous men have desired to see those things which ye see, and have not seen them, and to hear those things which ye hear, and have not heard them. Hear ye therefore the parable of the sower. When anyone heareth the word of the kingdom, and understandeth it not, then cometh the wicked one, and catcheth away that which was sown in his heart. This is he which received seed by the wayside. But he that received the seed into stony places, the same is he that heareth the word, and anon with joy receiveth it. Yet hath he not root in himself, but dureth for a while. For when tribulation or persecution ariseth because of the word, by and by he is offended. He also that received seed among the thorns is he that heareth the word, and the care of this world and the deceitfulness of riches choke the word, and he becometh unfruitful. But he that received seed into the good ground is he that heareth the word and understandeth it, which also beareth fruit, and bringeth forth some 100-fold, some 60, some 30. Another parable put he forth unto them, saying, The kingdom of heaven is likened unto a man which sowed good seed in his field. But while men slept, his enemy came and sowed tares among the wheat and went his way. But when the blade was sprung up and brought forth fruit, then appeared the tares also. So the servants of the householder came and said unto him, Sir, didst not thou sow good seed in thy field? From whence then hath it tares? He said unto them, An enemy hath done this. The servants said unto him, Wilt thou then that we go and gather them up? But he said, Nay, lest while ye gather up the tares, ye root up also the wheat with them. Let both grow together until the harvest. And in the time of harvest I will say to the reapers, Gather ye together first the tares, and bind them in bundles to burn them, but gather the wheat into my barn. Another parable put he forth unto them, saying, The kingdom of heaven is like to a grain of mustard seed, which a man took and sowed in his field, which indeed is the least of all seeds. But when it is grown, it is the greatest among herbs, and becometh a tree, so that the birds of the air come and lodge in the branches thereof. Another parable spake he unto them, The kingdom of heaven is like unto leaven, which a woman took and hid in 3 measures of meal, till the whole was leavened. All these things spake Jesus unto the multitude in parables, and without a parable spake he not unto them, that it might be fulfilled which was spoken by the prophet, saying, I will open my mouth in parables, I will utter things which have been kept secret from the foundation of the world. Then Jesus sent the multitude away, and went into the house. And his disciples came unto him, saying, Declare unto us the parable of the tares of the field. He answered and said unto them, He that soweth the good seed is the Son of Man. The field is the world. The good seed are the children of the kingdom, but the tares are the children of the wicked one. The enemy that sowed them is the devil. The harvest is the end of the world, and the reapers are the angels. As therefore the tares are gathered and burned in the fire, so shall it be in the end of this world. The Son of Man shall send forth his angels, and they shall gather out of his kingdom all things that offend, and them which do iniquity, and shall cast them into a furnace of fire. There shall be wailing and gnashing of teeth. Then shall the righteous shine forth as the sun in the kingdom of their Father. Who hath ears to hear, let him hear. Again, the kingdom of heaven is like unto treasure hid in a field, the which when a man hath found, he hideth, and for joy thereof goeth and selleth all that he hath, and buyeth that field. Again, the kingdom of heaven is like unto a merchantman seeking goodly pearls, who when he hath found one pearl of great price, went and sold all that he had, and bought it. Again, the kingdom of heaven is like unto a net that was cast into the sea, and gathered of every kind, which when it was full, they drew to shore, and sat down, and gathered the good into vessels, but cast the bad away. So shall it be at the end of the world. The angel shall come forth, and sever the wicked from among the just, and shall cast them into the furnace of fire. There shall be wailing and gnashing of teeth. Jesus saith unto them, Have ye understood all these things? They say unto him, Yea, Lord. Then said he unto them, Therefore every scribe which is instructed unto the kingdom of heaven is like unto a man that is an householder, which bringeth forth out of his treasure things new and old.
Hello. Welcome to Toronto Bible Study. I'm your host, Mike Sampat. Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining. I don't know who's here right now, but anyway, God bless you. So today we're going to look at the history of biblical interpretation. This is the third lecture, or whatever you want to call it, on this topic, this third video. And I hope to get through it this time, because anyway, look, guys, I thought this whole course would be like, like 12, 13 episodes, but I think it's going to be maybe a bit longer than that, because I didn't realize how much information it was. I wrote up my whole course plan, I was like, okay, we'll talk about this, this. And then when I actually look at the book, it's like way longer, it's like way more information, but anyway, it's okay. I think we'll It won't be too bad. But anyway, okay. So let me say a prayer real quick. Heavenly Father, Almighty God, Father, you're clothed in majesty. You're clothed in strength. Father, we're about to study the history of biblical interpretation, and we just ask that you give us wisdom now and give us strength and help us to understand these things and help us to learn how we can apply these things in our lives in a way that will glorify you and glorify your Holy Son, Jesus Christ. On him be glory forever and ever. Amen. All right, so let's get started, shall we? All right. So the first thing we're going to look at today, I mean, last time we talked about, we went up to like basically the Reformation period. So in the first episode, we looked at, or the first history episode, the first one we talked about like why do we need hermeneutics, and then the first history episode we went from basically the early church period up until I think the apostolic period, and then we went from the apostolic period, or then we went from after the apostolics was like the church fathers, the patristic period they call it, right? And we went from that up until the Reformation. So that was patristic, Middle Ages, Renaissance type of thing, and then Reformation, right? And then now we're into the post-Reformation period, okay? So where do we begin here? Oh, wait. I should probably put this on the hang on, you guys. Sorry, I gotta put this on the other version. What do you call it? The read only or something? Wait. What's going on here? A view, reading view. Okay. Okie doke. Okay, so the history of interpretation, part 3. Let's begin. So we're looking at the post-Reformation period now. The Renaissance happens alongside the Reformation, and it's a revival of classical philosophy and languages. So you see a lot of like the return of, for example, interest in Greek and Hebrew and other classical languages, even Latin. Latin was already popular, but not as a not like studied, you know. It's more like liturgical use, you know. But for this period, we had a lot of reinterest in those things, which included Hebrew and Greek, and so that included a new way of studying the Bible, or not a new way, but a new way for people at the time, anyway. And also, there was a lot of the classical philosophy had returned, right? So we talked a bit about that last time, like Aquinas and people like that. Hi, Liliana. How are you? God bless you. Thanks for joining. But yeah, so Aquinas and people like that, they brought back the philosophy of Plato, Aristotle, and the Greeks. And so they would often apply this type of thinking to the Bible and to theology, especially with the scholastics. Like Aquinas is like kind of like the proto-scholastic or the premier scholastic philosopher or theologian. And so that all that became to influence the biblical interpretation in the period. And that was, and the thing about the scholastics is they would apply this logic, especially Aristotelian logic. They would apply that kind of thinking to theology. And it was very helpful, but it had a lot of drawbacks too. And also there's a lot of Platonic thinking. And Platonism is a little bit outside of the scope of just pure logic. It's more like in the realm of metaphysics, where they're talking about the forms and what they'll say. Like Plato had this idea that there were forms, and so the forms would influence, or there was like these ideal forms, such as like the good or the ideal of truth. And those things existed above the material world. They're kind of in the spiritual plane that the material world could never achieve that level, you know? And so that was kind of a lot of Gnostic type thinking led out of that too, right? So that's why I don't really appreciate this turn into Platonism that Aquinas spearheaded. But I do think that the use of Aristotelian logic and stuff like that is very helpful in theology. So the movement, I mean, the period on the whole is generally a good thing, but there's lots of things that went wrong, I would say, as well. So we'll take a look at it. Okay, now during this period, Pietism began. Okay, and it's a movement that grew out of the Reformation. It begins in Germany in the 17th century, and it later spread to Western Europe and America. It was a reaction to scholasticism, because as I was saying to you, they applied the logic of Aristotle to. Thanks, Liliana. Hey, Nathan, what's up, bro? Thanks for joining, man. We're just talking about history of hermeneutics here. So, what was I saying? Yeah, Pietism is a reaction to scholasticism, because scholasticism, what they would often do is they're applying the logic to theology, but it would often become very kind of cold and impersonal, and also it seemed like almost not even biblical in the way they're thinking. Some of the things, the way they thought about it. So that's why there are people that were reacting to this. They didn't like it, and the Pietists were one of those groups. And they also reacted to this, and because of this scholastic way of thinking, or there's other influences as well. But Protestant worship services started to become very sterile and very formal. And I mean, you could go to a Lutheran or a Presbyterian service now, and you'll see what they were reacting to. All right, they didn't like that. It felt like it was very impersonal, and so their reaction was to come up with Pietism. So they wanted to revive Christianity as a way of life, not just this thing you do on Sundays and you go back to your life, but it's a way of life, right? And it requires holiness in your life. All right, that was important to them, but they actually felt that it was part of salvation too, that you had to have this holy life in order to go to heaven, which is obviously we're against that view, but for them it was very important. Well, some of the things that came down from them that influence us today are group Bible studies, which such as like the one I do on every weekday. That kind of idea where you have maybe one or two people who are sort of leading a Bible study, and then you have a bunch of people there, but not like a whole church congregation, but just like a small group, and you're just everyone's got their Bibles and they're just reading together and discussing. That kind of custom comes from these people. They kind of revived that because they wanted to have Bible studies to be a part of everyone's life, not just the preacher. They wanted everybody to be studying the Bible. And also their ways of praying also affected us as well. Like they thought prayer should be very personal as well, and also a part of like daily life. Not just something you do in church or something, for that part of your life, but just all of your life. And so they kind of brought that back in. And also personal morality. That is the idea that you want to have a personal kind of, you want to live this holy life all the time. It's not just a thing. It's not just, once again, not just a thing for Sundays, but it's your whole life. And it's necessary for going to heaven and to be a Christian in their mind, right? So they brought that idea in, and it still has influence on us today. And they used to be into a lot of devotional things. Like they would actually they would have like type of, like, I don't know, they would have things like, okay, encourage people to do very kind of, I don't know, devotional things. Like they would advise people to do things like every day get up and read a chapter of the Bible, or things like that. Have those kind of devotional things that you do all the time, and those kind of customs. And that's the thing that stuck with us today as well. So they did influence us quite a bit. Even other forms of. I mean, so these people are still around, right? The Pietists, like some of their like theological descendants are still with us, right? But everybody has been influenced by their way of doing Christianity in many ways. Like this group Bible study thing, that wasn't a thing before, and now everybody does it, including Catholics, including like Orthodox. So everybody does it now, right? So they really had a wide ranging influence. And also they wanted to focus on the devotional and ethical dimensions of Scripture, like how it speaks to your life and your relationship with God, not just these broad generalities about abstract ideas of morality and stuff, but just the impersonal reflection and personal relationship with God. They felt that was important. What is Pietism? I just joined, by the way. That's fine. Hey, how are you, by the way? Pejuang, Pangaran, Nasrani. Roman Catholic churches and East Orthodox churches don't encourage Bible study. Oh, is that true? Really? Don't they have these kind of things? I thought they did. I mean, they have a little bit, don't they? I mean, I know what you're saying. Like they don't try to, like, they tell people not to try to interpret it too much themselves, but to consult the church and consult the church's doctrines. But yeah, that's the type of thing. Yeah, that's the type of thing that the Pietists would do, at Liliana. And it's the type of thing that, yeah, like to this day, people are influenced by that kind of idea. Like every single day, check your Bible, check a verse or whatever. They would do that type of thing, Anyway, moving on. Where are we here? Pietism. So the beginning of Pietism was with this gentleman. Were Pietists heretics? Should Christians avoid them as heretics? Were they neo-Catholics? No, we Free Graces would consider them heretics because they thought that you have to be holy in your life to go to heaven. So yeah, we would consider them heretics, but at the time they weren't considered heretics. They were just considered like basically, Orthodox Protestants. And even to this day, right, they are. They weren't neo-Catholics though. They were kind of like a reaction to some of the ways that, like, it's after the Reformation, right? So you have the Protestant movement has come up, and then these guys are coming out of the Protestant movement saying, you know what, Protestantism, as it has, like, they appreciated a lot of the things that Protestantism did, like leaving the Catholic Church, but they were also against a lot of the things. So they started up. But Philip Jacob Spener was the guy who started it up in Germany. He preached about personal conversion, and having an intimate personal relationship with God. So your conversion is something that you do. You come to this realization about Christ and come to accept him as they would say, or so it's a personal thing that you have to make that commitment. It's not like you grow up in the church and then all of a sudden you're just a Christian for the rest of your life. No, you have to, at some point in your life, you have to come to this personal realization and devotion to Christ. And also they stress this intimate personal relationship with God. It wasn't like your life is not just, you don't just go around and obey God's rules. You have to have this actual relationship with him, talk to him, pray to him, and live the life that you think he wants. Yeah, that's somewhat true. I mean, I would say the Catholics are heretics. Yeah, definitely. But anyway, so I might not be able to address your comments, guys, because I'm going through the lecture. But I'll try to get to it. So, and this is the thing about the Pietists, like Spener. He stressed this stuff: devotional, practical study of the Bible. So, like Liliana's saying there, kind of every day, a little bit of reading, devotionally. you devote this time to study, and also study in a way that's practical. You want to study the Bible not just to learn what it says, but how does it practically apply to our lives, which you may think that that's obvious, but it's actually not as obvious as you might think. And a lot of people didn't really have this mentality about the Bible back then. So it is kind of an innovation. But their methodology in terms of hermeneutics, they were very literalistic. So they would just read what it says is what it means, and they try to go to the historical understanding of it, similar to what we do often. And they would try to have this common sense approach. So it's like what it says is what it means. Again, it's not trying to reinterpret things as we might want it to say, but just, or I don't know, how do we describe the common sense approach? It's like they're literal, but they're also saying that they don't try to hang on, sorry. Yeah, so they wouldn't want, they have a literalistic common sense approach, meaning it's just what it says is what it is. They don't try to like read into it too much and pull out different meanings out of the text that's not there. They just read what it says. That's what it is. And also they would get into the Hebrew and Greek, and they would get very close on grammar, which is important and also influenced us today. And they're always looking at, like I say, devotional and practical implications. So what does this text mean for how we're supposed to live our life? And practically, like, what is this? How does this mean for like our lives today, in our practical daily lives? How do we put this in? So that's pietism there. Then Methodism was an English movement, which is kind of growing out of pietism as well, or it has many commonalities with it. This started with John Wesley, and he wanted to recover personal piety and holiness through Bible study and prayer. So he was very much into the idea of he's very much into the idea of personal piety and holiness. So he felt like that was also like Spener. He thought that was necessary to go to heaven. You have to live this holy life, and so he encouraged that. And also he felt that part of this life of piety and holiness involved everyone studying the Bible and praying devotionally, like regularly, like daily is not even enough, right? For them, it was like very often praying, right? And but they felt that it wasn't just a matter of, okay, the preacher studies the Bible and tells you how to live. It's like everyone has to study the Bible, And they both use the KJV, which is nice. And as I was saying, oh yeah, by the way, there's not just the idea of the Bible studies in small groups originated with them, but the prayer groups, which also still kind of remains to this day, right? Where people will get together, and their main focus in their get-together is just to pray. And this is something that originates with these English pietists like John Wesley, the Methodists, okay? And then Edwards was the American, like, strain of pietism, okay? And he also is very similar to the others. He emphasizes practical application of the Bible to doctrine and stuff. And he would often use typology. So, for example, Genesis 29:20. What is this? This might be, I think this is the story. Oh, this is a story when Jacob, in order to marry his wife, in order to like get the father-in-law to give the wife to him, right? Rachel, right, who he loved. He had to work for him for 7 years. So by that, he compared Jacob to Christ. He compared Christ like Christ labored, and he also sacrificed his life and died for us out of love, right? So they felt like that means that Jacob is a type of Christ in that situation. Now, whether that's true or not, we could debate, but that was his interpretation, and that's the typology they would use. Okay, was Matthew Henry a pietist? Not sure about that. I think he was, though. I think he was a Methodist. I think Catholic crusades were criminals. Many innocent people were accused of witchcraft and hang or burned alive. Also, the natives of other nations didn't accept Christianity were killed. Yeah, the Catholics were pretty bad in the Crusades, but it wasn't just like, I mean, it was like the whole Europe, or not a whole Europe, a lot of Western European nations were involved in the Crusades, right? And the Catholics did start it up. Yeah, that's true too. That's true too. But it's not like, I mean, the Muslims, when the Muslims controlled Portugal, it wasn't that much better, right? It's like, I don't know. It's very, yeah, but maybe there was in terms of like, but then I think the big problem was to me, the Crusades were kind of obviously very bad in many ways, but they're also a reaction to Muslim aggression, because the Muslims have been threatening Europe for so many years. They'd already taken over Spain and Portugal, most of it. So people were just scared, and they had to do something, kind of thing, right? So, but when it comes to like the Inquisition and stuff, that I would say is definitely pretty bad. Was J.C. Ryle a Protestant? I don't know who that is, brother. Sorry, but you can probably Google that. So the other thing that happened in the Renaissance period, or in that period between 1650 and 1750, is the birth of the Enlightenment. So the Renaissance is bringing us out of the Middle Ages, where it was basically just kind of most of the theology and the philosophy was just sort of European or Western Europe or English, you might say, or something like that, or Western Europe. But then they had lost access to a lot of the Greek philosophy and those type of things. But when it came back, then you had the Renaissance, and then eventually it gives birth to the Age of Reason, the Enlightenment. All right, and this the main thing that separated the Enlightenment from other periods is rationalism. Sorry. So rationalism is the idea that the human mind is independent, is itself an independent authority, and capable of determining truth on its own using reason, right? Whereas before, most people would say that the human mind relies on God's revelation to find the truth. During this period, they felt that no, we can't rely on God's revelation. That would be superstitious or something like that. So that we must rely on rationality and the human mind. I know. Where was the love of God? It's true. A lot of violence back then. It was a cruel time, but you know what? Christianity was a positive force in a lot of people's lives. Now, this idea of hey, glory to him. How are you, brother? Thanks for joining. So the thing about this Age of Reason, Enlightenment thinking, right, is it a lot of it lay in the roots of humanism. Humanism is the idea that humanity and human life are kind of the basic source of truth and goodness in our world, And it's not trying to say that God isn't part of that, but that human reason and humanity is itself capable of determining truth and determining morality and all these things. So Erasmus, by moving into humanism and that way of thinking about the Bible, which was it was good in many ways, right? But it led to some other negative things as well. Yeah, that's true. Hey, brother. God bless you, typical. So, yeah, but Erasmus used reason to study the Bible in the original languages, which is a good thing, right? Because people had kind of lost access to that. They're basically they went to the church, they learned from the pastor or the priest, and then they went home. And also, the priests, they would read in Latin. So most of the people didn't even know how to speak Latin. So they didn't know what they were hearing from the Bible. So they completely relied on the priest to tell them, And so that was bad. And also even the priests, they didn't know how to read Hebrew and Greek either. They just knew Latin, So it was kind of like Christianity was breaking away from its original root, in the Hebrew and Greek original text, right? So that was a good thing that Erasmus did this, I do believe. But Erasmus believed that reason helped establish the Christian faith, but this laid the groundwork for what would happen later, which is that people would start to use reason as a way to kind of overthrow the authority of the church and even the Bible itself. And we'll see that as we go through the history of interpretation as we continue on. Is that right? Is that right? Indians, Pakistanis, and Afghanis? Oh no. Why? That's too bad. Oh yeah, by the way, back then, I mean, rationalism today, you might think it's like, oh, the Bible's stupid. Right? That's what people think of when they think of rationalism now. They think the Bible is just a dumb myth. But actually, rationalism back then, it wasn't hostile to Christianity. They just felt that reason was the supreme thing, even in matters of religion, even in matters of theology, right? So they never felt like, oh, now we have reason, so we can reject the Bible, we can reject Christianity. That wasn't the thought. The thought is that they need to use reason to understand the Bible, and that the Bible is not just this revealed thing. Or that's kind of, at the time they still felt that, but it was like pushing back on that idea that it's just a revealed truth and you just have to figure out what that is. Instead, they're trying to say reason is the truth and the Bible is going to conform to reason, So that was the problem in their minds. For example, you have Thomas Hobbes in his book Leviathan. He argued that Moses lived before the Pentateuch was completed. So he began that way of thinking where people would start to say, wait a minute, is it true that Moses really wrote the Pentateuch? Is that really true? Does that make any sense? And so he began that type of thinking, and that would advance to I would say ridiculous extents nowadays, But I think Hobbes didn't even believe that Moses wrote any of it, which is very radical at the time, right? But nowadays many people believe something like that, So I don't agree, but I think Moses wrote most of it. But I do appreciate the idea that there may be parts of the book that Moses wasn't firsthand doing it, that there was some additions, maybe some editing going on later on. I don't have a problem with that idea. And then Richard Simon wrote the critical history of the Old Testament. He was a French secular priest, and he agreed with Hobbes on the Moses thing. And he questioned a lot of the chronology of the OT, that is the timeline. Like, is it true that this happened back then? That this happened back then? He doesn't really necessarily believe the timeline as the Bible gives it to us. Okay. And this is when people first start to kind of strongly question the idea of whether the Bible is a truly historical document, And of course, that at the same time, they're questioning the scientific validity of the Bible as well, right? But I won't talk about that too much here. But around this time, people are now questioning whether the Adam and Eve story is true and stuff like this, right? Of course, there's always some people that were questioning it throughout history, but this is when it becomes more commonplace. And then we had this man, Bernard Spinoza, he was a Jewish philosopher, and he had some different ways of thinking about God. He also argued for the primacy of reason in hermeneutics. So we need to use reason and logic, which is, once again, although I disagree with most of their thinking on these things, the fact that he brought this idea of reason as the primary thing in when we're doing hermeneutics, this is very important, very useful, and it's something that we still use today. And so it's very important what he did here. Even though I would disagree with most of his thoughts on the Bible, it's very good what he did here in terms of bringing in this idea of reason. But he kind of felt like scripture should be studied like all the other books, just like any other book. It's not a special book from God. It's just an ancient book. So study it just like other ancient books. So when we investigate the history of another ancient book like Plato's Republic or the Iliad, there's certain rules of methods of investigation that we use, and we should just use the same ones when we study the Bible. We shouldn't try to like expect this to be some special book that has special rules, you know. But of course, that's not true, and we shouldn't. And we nowadays know, or I mean, people like me, teachers like me, we would say that that's untrue. That the Bible is a special case. For example, the KJVO argument requires that we think of the Bible as a special case in ancient texts. Ancient texts generally we use critical. We use what do you call it? Not critical, text criticism to understand how the book came down and which copies are legit and which copies are maybe wrong, right? We use those kind of methods, text criticism, and we use that in the Bible as well. But when we look at the Bible, the Bible needs to be a special case in text criticism. It's not like all the other cases. Because it's just a very, very different document. Wow, I'm taking forever. Anyway. And so, yeah, Spinoza rejected the idea that God intervened in history. They don't believe that. They don't believe that God made any changes in history. And he felt like when we see miracles and those type of things in the Bible, it was just an ancient, like, Hebrew mythological way of explaining history, and then we should interpret it that way. The same way we would interpret, like, when the Greeks said that Zeus was throwing lightning bolts, that's why we have lightning, because Zeus was throwing lightning bolts. We understand that that's just them trying to explain something that they can't explain. So they come up with that idea. And he felt like the Bible was similar in that regard, even though he felt like we could, or actually, I won't talk about that. But yeah, he felt like we should see the Bible in the same way. We should see it as these Hebrew people were trying to explain something that they can't explain, so they made up this story. That's the way that he saw it. And so the miracle stories were invented to keep ignorant people in obedience. It's like to make you afraid of God, and okay, we have to obey, otherwise he's got miraculous powers, so he's gonna destroy us. So that's how he felt. That's why all those things were introduced. So he thought that the human mind was kind of above scripture in terms of determining truth and determining morality. Okay. And then by the way, and then also there was this fragmentation of hermeneutics at the time. Okay. Because the pietists were there, they're searching the scriptures for their holiness idea. They've got their Bible studies, and they're looking through carefully and all those things. And then the rationalists, they wanted to take philosophy and theology and separate them, whereas before they had been very closely linked, and they still are. But they wanted to separate them in the sense that the search for truth is philosophy, and theology is just theology. So philosophy is the search for truth. Philosophy in their mind, right? It's like reason and thinking about things. That's how we can find truth, not by studying the Bible. So that was part of their mentality. So as we get into the 18th century now, you have this decline in rationalism, but at the same time, it's still maintaining this very strong undercurrent, and it's going to revive in the 19th century. But a lot of Spinoza's ideas that we were talking about before, he was very influential in hermeneutics at the time. Okay. And then the 19th century. So this is like the 1800s, right? This is like real revolutionary period. Okay. And a lot of things changed. I don't know why this book that I got for this thing, it doesn't really focus too much on German pietism. There's going to be a little bit about it, but not German pietism, sorry, German deism. German deism really, I think, affected a lot of these things, but they talk about it kind of in a different way, though. But anyway, So the 19th century saw this huge expansion of missions and missionary work. So Christians in Europe would go out to the colonies and all over the world and try to spread the gospel by speaking to people, by building churches in different locations around the world. And that became this huge custom that still is with us today again, right? But that was when we had this huge expansion during that period, okay? And now it's like very big still, but at the time it was huge. Yeah, the Bible's a spiritual book, so you can't treat it like other books, you know? Amen, amen, brother. So there was also a repudiation of Christianity by intellectuals. So a lot of the academics, a lot of the high level intellectuals were saying that the Bible is no longer useful to tell us about history or the origin of humanity or even a lot of like the moral reasoning. They felt like the Bible was just deficient. Okay. And so that's the beginning of that. And that, of course, is what we see today as well. But this is the sort of beginning of it. But it was at this time, not the beginning of it, but it's at this time when it becomes mainstream. You know what I mean? There was other people skeptical about the Bible before, but now it becomes like pretty much across the board for intellectuals. It was no longer considered a source of accurate history or accurate science or anything. Obviously not science, but it was never like when they think about the origin of humanity or the origin of the universe, they didn't feel like the Bible was the source for that. And also the scientific method was advanced quite rapidly in the 19th century as well. It was this is kind of like the end of the scientific revolution, but the scientific revolution has now taken place. And now pretty much everybody thinks the source of truth is science and the scientific method, and there's not many other ways you can determine truth. And so religion was sort of forsaken at this point, right? And also you have this idea of what we could call developmentalism. The book is calling it this developmentalism. I've never heard this term applied to it, but it's this mentality that history is progressing and it's advancing. Okay, so whereas before we were primitive, now we're going up and we're going to be advanced and we're going to continue up and up and up forever. And so history is advancing slowly and progressing and making everything better. And you get these thinkers like Hegel, Marx, and Darwin, which all have this kind of mentality where it's like history is a succession of things of one society kind of falling off and then another better society coming along and then that falling off and then another better one coming along. So in their mind, it was like cavemen, tribal things. That's like the most primitive. And then when you come to like in their mind again, like Western, like medieval Europe or Rome and stuff like that, the Greeks and Rome, that's better than tribal, right? Then after that, you have the Middle Ages, the castles, the knights, and then you have the Renaissance. They felt like the Renaissance is better than the knights and the Middle Ages. And then you have in their period, they felt like their period was the peak of human civilization, but they did feel that it would continue to progress. Hegel is the kind of philosophical father of Marx, and Darwin is obviously the father of the evolutionary theory. And then at this time, that's when they first started using this historical critical method. Okay, so this is different than we often talk about historical or what they call historical grammatical. That's different than this. All right, this is historical critical. It's a little bit different. I'm going to explain it. My grandma baptized me as a baby in Catholic church. Then up until I was 10 years old, I had to go to church. The priest would speak all the service in Latin. Everything was very superstitious. Oh, it used to be Catholic? Oh, that's, yeah, because Portugal is mainly Catholic, right? Oh, you're saying Charles Darwin from Satan? Yeah. I mean, I'd say he's satanic, yeah. Like he would give out little figures of saints for protection. Really weird. Yeah, they do that, yeah. I know. So sad. So the historical critical method. So like we always talk about the historical grammatical. So in that sense, what you're looking at is the historical context of the author and his audience. What is he trying to say to his audience in their period, in that time, you know? Because it's different than reading it to us, somebody today. It's like why when Paul writes his letter to the Romans, you have to consider, okay, at that time the temple was still there, the Jews were still going there and burning the sacrifices and stuff. You have to consider all that in terms of how you read the Bible. What is he trying to say to the Roman church at that time? That's historical. And then we use the grammatical. The grammatical part is we're going to look very closely at the grammar of every sentence to make sure exactly what is the author saying. What is the grammar of the words that he uses? What does it indicate? How can we establish the meaning of it by the grammar? And they do that too. These people, the historical critical people, they do that as well. But they introduce these other ideas, like such as they'll say, for example, that the Bible itself is written by. It's not written like the author of the Bible is not whoever it says that the name of it, you know. So for example, the book of Matthew is not written by Matthew. It's written by a bunch of people we don't even know who, or they try to figure it out. They try to like determine that, and based on their theory of who they think wrote it, then that determines kind of what do they really mean. So it's not Matthew writing to a bunch of Christian Jews. That's what we think normally. But they would say, no. It's some of Matthew's followers. They formed a community. Then they created this book, and they were writing it to, yes, Christian Jews or something. So that's how they interpret it. And it's a different interpretation if you think of it as a different author, right? You know? Hey, Chris. God bless you, brother. Thanks for joining. Oh, that's good. So their positions are this. They have certain philosophical positions that they like. Everybody, when you study anything, you have to have certain philosophical assumptions that you're going to make as you go in. The historical grammatical method that I just described to you, right? That's based on certain philosophical assumptions, such as the idea that the literal meaning of what it says, that's what it means. In the historical context, that's also a philosophical assumption, right? So it's a correct one, but it's one that we make, right? Their positions are different. They say, for example, the human reason is the best tool to study the Bible, which is to some extent, this is somewhat true, and we still hold to this somewhat today, but they take it further than we would. They would also say that the Bible is like any other book, not divine revelation. This is where we differ, right? People such as us. Or such as myself. I don't think of the Bible as not divine revelation. I think it certainly is divine revelation, right? So it's a different way of thinking about it. And also part of that aspect of thinking about the Bible is that it's naturalism, or what they'll say is there's no supernatural things. So the story that Jesus rose from the dead, that's supernatural, obviously, right? So they're going to have some other explanation for it. They're going to say, it's probably because the disciples, they wanted to continue the movement that Jesus started, so they had to come up with a story or something like that. They'll come up with some kind of theory like that, right? But that's what that is. And then also they continued this idea of developmentalism, where history is advancing and we're moving onward and upward. And it's just getting better and better. Humanity is just, over time, humanity is just going to progress and progress until we're just better and better, okay? Earlier eras were primitive, now later ones are more advanced, and we're going to advance more and more until we eventually reach some kind of promised land or something, but that's the idea in their mind, okay? And as we there's some more philosophical assumptions they make. Some of them are like this. The Bible's ideas are time bound, not timeless. So what they mean by that is a lot of the things, or almost all the things that they said in the Bible, were part of their culture at that time, and that's why they said it. So when, for example, the classic one is when Paul says, I suffer not a woman to teach, he's just talking to people at that time, in that era, in the ancient Greek, or sorry, that was ancient like Turkey, in that time and place. That's why he said that. But that wouldn't be something that we should apply to all humanity forever, you know? And that's obviously debatable, but that was their mentality about those things. Yeah, well, I mean, they would dispute that, but you're right in the sense that they've never disproven any historical claim of the Bible. And the thing is, a lot of the times when they try to deny it, they'll try to say that, oh, that's wrong, that's wrong, that's wrong. And then later on, things will happen. They'll make discoveries, they'll find out things, and then they'll say, well, you know what? The Bible was right. That happens again and again and again. And it's sad that they never learn the lesson, you know, that every time they doubt the Bible, it turns out to be true. Like, again and again. I can't even tell you how many times this has happened. It's really quite astounding, actually. Like all it's like one of the best sources, the Bible, for archaeology of that period in that area, right? Like classical period, and also the antiquities period, right? If you go back to, if you check the archaeology of that area, like the Levant, I mean, where Israel is today and those type of areas, the Bible is the number one source for archaeologists of the time, you know? Anyway, so they had this idea that the Bible contributes moral and ethical values, but that they would not believe many of the theological claims and the historical claims. So they're trying to extract these things out of the Bible, such as how we should live our life morally and ethically, but they don't believe any of the historical and other claims, okay? And then a lot of there were some shifts in focus that occurred at this time. So one was this idea of, when you look at a book of the Bible, they will look at the credibility of it. What they mean is how much of this was actually original and how much is not. And also, because they don't believe that all of the book of, let's say the book of Deuteronomy, they'll say some of it was written, or they'll say the book of Deuteronomy was written much later, much later, after they got back from like Babylon. Some of them will argue stuff like that, or they'll say this book, some of it was written before, like Daniel. They'll say most of Daniel was written when they got taken to Babylon, but some of it, the last part, like from chapter 7 or chapter 8 to the end, they'll say that part was written much later in the 2nd century BC. So, which is like 400 years after Daniel died, right? So they're trying to say, they'll try to say those type of arguments. And that's what they call source criticism. That was one of the first of the critical methods here. The first one, of the earliest one, was source criticism. And then they also wanted to trace the historical development of the Bible. Like I'm saying to you, do you have a video on archaeological discoveries that support the Bible? I don't, but I will. That's a good idea. Thanks. I'll look into that and I'll make a live about it or something. That's a really good idea. Thanks, Blurry. Yeah, like because of this, for instance, what Pejuang is asking about, right? With Daniel has a prophecy in chapter 8 about Alexander the Great. It's quite clear that he's talking about Alexander the Great. He's talking about Alexander 400 years before Alexander did what he did. So they can't explain that, right? So how do they explain that? They have to say, okay, it must have been that it was written after Alexander. So they just say that's what they say, you know, and they have their other, they don't just come with that evidence just like that. They have other evidence that they try to bring, but their arguments aren't that strong as you might think. Hi, Crafty Val. God bless you. So when they say they sought to trace the historical development of the Bible, what they're saying is that, yeah, they didn't believe that it was all written in the time of when it originated, right? Or when it's talking about. So they try to figure out who wrote when. And some parts, they'll say some parts of the books were written early and other parts are written later, and they mix it up. So that's what they'll do. And they'll also argue that later writers would edit things in and change things, okay? Yeah. This is what Chris is talking about. Yeah, they will claim that the Daniel from chapter 7 to chapter 12 was written around 200 BC because it has so much fulfilled prophecy. Chris is very knowledgeable about Daniel. Yeah, exactly. All those details. Yeah, exactly. Very accurate, man. And it's just impossible that Daniel could do that unless he had some kind of like supernatural gifting, you know. But okay, so then we get into the modern period, what they call the modern period. Now, you may think the modern period is like today, right? This is like when we say modern, we think of it as right now. But the modern period in history is considered to be from the late 18th century up until today. And today they'll actually call it like postmodern and stuff like that. They'll say that they won't really call this modern anymore. The modern so-called period is like really ending in like the 19th or early 20th century or something like that, you know. What we have now today, or at least from the end of the Second World War, they call this like postmodern. Okay, but anyway, that's a whole other discussion. So then you have this guy F.C. Barr. He was into historical theology. He's from Tübingen. And he argued Paul's letters reflected the vision in apostolic Christianity. That is, Paul was against Peter and the other apostles. That was his belief, okay? So Jerusalem was Peter and the disciples, and Paul and the Gentiles, they were kind of opposing that. Okay, that was his view. And so New Testament books that don't reflect that conflict are post-apostolic. They're written after the apostles, and they're kind of changed and stuff like that to make it kind of meld and make it look like they're all friends. But the actual truth was that there was this split in the church, and so that was his interpretation anyway, right? And so that's why he dated Acts and the Gospels to the 2nd century. He was one of the first persons to try to do that. Nowadays, most scholars will say it was almost all written in the 1st century, but there are some people that still say this kind of thing. And also, yeah, he felt like the story that we read about in the New Testament about the history of the church, that was actually not the real history. That there's an actual history to kind of piece out, or we have to figure out somehow by studying, right? But it's not, the Bible is not telling us the accurate history. That's his mentality. Then you have Julius Wellhausen. He's like in OT studies, right? So he's changing that. This is like, because this guy, he's more focused on the New Testament, right? But this guy is more focused on the Old Testament. So he began this idea of the 4 sources theory. They'll say like there's this source like the Q, or not the Q source. Sorry, they'll say there's the Yahwist source. Okay, those are like, there's people that they're, I don't know, they call God by his name, by his holy name and stuff, and that's one set of writers. And then there's another set of writers. They call them there's this thing called the J source, and then there's the L source. They have different like sources. They felt like there was 4 streams that kind of 4 periods of time where 4 different groups of people were making major changes to the Pentateuch. Okay. And also in their mind, of course, Moses could not have written any of the Pentateuch, not even one word of it. And the law was not something that the Hebrews had and then they wrote about it in their books, but rather the law came when they wrote the books, right? Or after the books. And it was changed in that period. Okay. So for example, Kings, the book of Kings and the book of Samuel and stuff, they don't like, these people would argue that the law was written after those things. Okay. And so in their mind, the actual history of Israel is very different than what we read in the Bible. Adolf von Harnack, what is Christianity? Okay. So this is like liberal theology. This is a kind of theology where they They don't believe the Bible is the entire source of theology. It's like, I mean, obviously we've seen the roots of this type of thinking already, right? But this is now where it becomes to the point of theologians are actually denying the Bible's truth. They're saying the Bible is a source of theological kind of almost like advice or something. It gives us like a way of thinking about theology, but it doesn't give us actual theology. We have to use reason and stuff to really think up theology. And also even morality and all those things. It's not in the book. The book is just giving us a kind of image or something. It's I don't know. It's giving us something to start from, and then we build our reasoning about these things from that starting point. So a lot of the Bible is like symbolic or allegorical, and we need to figure out the true meaning behind it, and then we need to figure out theology and morality from that. Okay, so that's their thinking on that. So he wanted the Protestants to return to the religion of Jesus. So he's saying that there's the religion we have today based on a kind of literal reading of the Bible. And then he's saying, no. The actual Jesus, the real Jesus, had a different religion. And we need to figure out what that is by reading the Bible, not just reading it, what it says, but actually looking at it like with this critical thinking way of thinking about it and saying, okay, they wrote this. Why would they write this? Probably because, they'll come up with some theory as to why they would write it. And then based on that theory, they'll reason out what it really means or what it really should say to us today. That was their way of seeing it. And so the church is giving us a different portrait of Jesus than what the real Jesus is. Okay, and we need to find the real Jesus to get the real message. Okay, but he had three essential teachings of the Bible that he felt were absolutely true and could not be denied as a Christian. Okay, that is that the kingdom of God is still coming. It's coming in the future. It will be here. God is our Father, and the human soul has infinite value. So, which is another truth of the Bible, definitely true, right? But he's putting that as like this thing that, okay, other things in the Bible are definitely deniable, but these type of things that the Bible teaches, these are true. And also the commandment of love. So loving one another is clearly a core teaching of the Bible, and so we have to stick with that. But other things in the Bible we can deny, or we can act like that's not reasonable. And so that was his way of thinking about that. So these people, the way they're thinking about it, they undermine the thought that we have that the Bible is historically reliable. All right, so this is the first. There were people before that were questioning it, but this is where it really becomes part of almost mainstream Christian thought, where these guys are very important and influential scholars at the time. So for them to say that, not just a few outlier people, but these guys are really big, influential, like mainstream guys saying this, right? So it really did undermine the idea of the Bible's historical reliability. And so when you think that the Bible might not be historically reliable, the next thing you might think is that the Bible is not really from God, right? Which obviously many people did begin to think that. And also they would downplay the emphasis on the actual meaning of the text, which we focus on, right? And they're focusing more on who is the source of the text and also the history that the text came down. How did that influence it? And that's how they would interpret it as well. That would be kind of the origin, or it's like the starting point of their analysis is not on the text itself, but in the sources, their theories about the sources and the history, which is all theoretical, by the way. That's not something that they could prove anything, right? But they would come up with their theories, and then they would use their theories to interpret the book. And although these people, they were the dominant view at the time, but there were many challenges to them. So we'll look at some of those. H. Ewald and M. Collar, they were kind of against that idea. They had their own interpretive ideas about it. And then you have J.B. Lightfoot. He wrote the Apostolic Fathers, and he went into disproving a lot of Barr's assumptions. If you want to look at Barr's assumptions here, he would say these type of things, especially with the New Testament. He would kind of question the historicity of the different things in the New Testament. But when Lightfoot came along, he was showing that no, the New Testament, maybe some of the things you might say we could challenge or something, but for the most part, according to Lightfoot, and it was very well received, most of the New Testament is very historical and very historically reliable. And so he went into those arguments. And then these three, Warfield, Green, and Beecher, they didn't like this type of thinking. They were called the New Criticism, and they had their own kind of critical view. Their view is also critical, not like what we would consider to be historical grammatical, but they had a different idea about it. But they also got into this idea of the inductive study. Inductive study is like when you say, you kind of just look at the text and just read the text. All the meaning is in the text. You're not trying to like think about other things and other influences. You're just reading what it says and just examining that, And also they would use this idea of Scottish common sense to kind of put their ideas forward. Let me see if I can find more about that. Scottish common sense. Sorry, you guys. Scottish common sense. Where did I read about that? So yeah, so Scottish common sense is the idea that like some ideas are just true. They don't need to be defended. They're just self-evidently true. Okay? And so they would kind of say those type of things. Certain ideas, I don't need to have some kind of philosophical defense for it. I don't need to prove the truth of it. It just is true, and we should obviously assume that it's true. And so that way of thinking, there's value in that as well. There are certain things that you don't need to really question them so much. Hey, Pickleball, what's up, brother? Thanks for joining. Yes, that's right. Jesus said his words will never pass away. Amen. But anyway, moving on. So then you had this kind of restoration movement. So these people, they're reacting to that idea, right? They're reacting to this like kind of movement in academia. They're moving away from traditional ideas about the Bible. So then these guys, they're reacting to that and saying, let's go back. Let's return to this. And so Barton Stone and Alexander Campbell were some of their big thinkers. And they would often, a lot of their influence was from Acts and the epistles, okay? And he anticipated a lot of the 20th century evangelical thought on hermeneutics that we now have today, especially this idea of the inductive study. That was big for them. And the inductive study, we still use it today. It's very, very useful, very effective. And so these people, like I say, a lot of their things, we think of it as like silly almost, right? But at the time, it wouldn't have been silly. And then some of their things, we know it's wrong now, but the other things that they brought in are very good and we still use them. So that's why it's good to understand these things. But in the late 19th century, that's when Pentecostalism started to rise up, okay? Pentecostalism is the idea that, that God can maybe speak to you in your head like an audible voice of God, that you could hear him speaking to you. And also they often have the idea that that you might be able to speak in tongues or perform miracles such as healings or prophecies, okay? So that was Pentecost. That arose in the late 19th century, but it really took off in the 20th century. But they felt like the way to go back to the old, like they wanted to return to the, actually, as many people often do, they want to return to the Christianity of the New Testament, the Christianity of the authors of the New Testament. That is true Christianity, right? So they wanted to do that too, but they felt like the way to do that was through supernatural experiences. This just as the authors of the New Testament had these supernatural experiences, right? Such as like miracles and stuff. So they felt like the real way to return to that is by having those things. And so, yeah, two approaches that grew out of the 19th century that are still very influential, right? Is this one, the history of religions approach. So they'll look at like other cultures around there, because before this they didn't really know too much about those cultures, right? Like they knew there was Egypt, they knew there was Babylon and stuff, and whatever, the Assyrians and stuff, but they didn't really know too much, in depth. But as in the 19th century, they started like getting into like archaeology and those type of things, and they started to find out lots of new information and new things about those people, And so they wanted to use that new information they were learning as a way to understand the Bible better. And in some ways they did. They succeeded in helping us to understand the Bible better. In other ways, I would argue that they kind of, I don't know, they sort of confused the situation as well, right? But since then, we've been able to look back at what they did, and we can see where they were right and where they were wrong, and we can talk about that as we go forward. Well, one thing that a lot of what they often would try to claim, these guys, is that when we see similarities in some of the myths of the other pagan cultures of that region, right? The region, the A&E is the ancient Near East. Ancient Near East. So, or what we would call the Middle East today. They back then, when we talk about them, we say the ancient Near East. And so that area where Israel is, there's all these cultures around there as well, right? Like the Egyptians, the Mesopotamians, the Assyrians, the Palestinians, what they're called the Philistines. Okay, and so what am I trying to say here? Sorry guys, I'm like, my brain's like shutting down already. It's been a long last couple of nights, but anyway. Yeah, basically, so let's say the Mesopotamians have a myth about like a flood, a global flood, which they do, right? And many other cultures do as well, right? So let's not try to say it's just them, but they do. And so these guys will say, oh, well, that's where they got it. That's where the Hebrews got it. They got it from the Mesopotamians, yeah? And so it's not a matter of some original story that the Hebrews came up with, or even certainly not a revelation from God in their mind, right? It's just like the Hebrews were just another culture in that area, and they just happened to pick up this story from the other cultures in the area, and they wrote it into the Bible, and then that's what we get. That's the way they saw it. Adolf and Harnack. Oh, you know about this guy, eh? Israel in the ancient world was like modern day Bhutan. It was in between two major powers. Yeah, that's right. Unlike Bhutan, they had God. That's right. So some of the influences of this approach on our thinking today, it showed, for example, that many of the biblical ideas did originate earlier than the Bible. For instance, the idea of the flood is older than the Bible, obviously, right? Because the Bible was written until the days of Moses. Even from our view, from the more traditional classical view, or whatever you want to call it, our view, we would still say that the Bible was written long after the flood, right? And long after many of these other cultures wrote about the flood as well. So the Babylonians and other Mesopotamians, when they wrote about the flood, it was before the Hebrew Bible was written. Okay, so that was a good thing. Now, how did they disprove Wellhausen? I forget this was point of my thing. What was I talking about here? Anyway, says Wellhausen thought that many of these things came much later, much later. You know, but now when you have this idea that it came before, it's like why do we have to assume that it's some later interpretation? You know. For example, some of the ancient law codes in the Law of Moses, right? Wellhausen would argue that it wasn't written by Moses in those days; it was written much later. But then when we read some of the other ancient writers from those other cultures, like Mesopotamia stuff, we can see that they had stuff. They had law codes that were very similar to the Law of Moses, and they even had laws that were very similar, like eye for an eye. Eye for an eye is in the Bible. It's also in the code of Hammurabi of Babylon, right? So by understanding that, we can say that Wellhausen thought that it was later just because of these other considerations. But if it was even before that, if Hammurabi had eye for an eye even before the Law of Moses, why should we think that the Law of Moses didn't come from those days, right? So he's disproving. So the history of religion's idea, although many of the things that they talk about we would argue against, there are many ideas that they came up with through their methods and through their research that are still helpful and useful to us today, right? And the comparative principle, proper interpretation relies on cultural evidence, right? So this is like the idea that you don't want to interpret things outside of the cultural context that it's from. You know, when for example, how can I say this? Let's say if you're talking about the Samaritans and the Hebrews or the Jews in the time of Jesus, right? If you don't understand that the Jews thought that the Samaritans were this like wicked pagans, and they didn't even talk to them, and they thought of them as like these half-breed like subhuman types, you know. If you don't understand that, we won't understand the Bible, right? So they would use that kind of historical knowledge to improve our understanding of the Bible, you know. And this is something we still do today as well. So that's the type of thing. Then you have form criticism. Okay, so Hermann Gunkel, who was this German scholar, right? He felt that the Bible, that's like the Bible wasn't written down originally, but that there were these kind of oral tradition where they would talk about these stories, and it would be handed down from one father to the son, and then eventually they wrote it down. Eventually. But his thought was that what we really need to do is go back and figure out what those original oral things said, and then we can understand the Bible properly. So he'll just say, oh, this section is probably from an earlier period, this section is probably from a later period. He'll cut it up like that, and he'll try to come up with historical theories of how to explain those things, and then based on those theories, that's how he's going to interpret the book. But it's very roundabout and very kind of difficult to figure out what's true and what isn't, right? But one thing that was useful from his thought is that this idea of trying to determine the cultural life setting of the writer. So, which is, again, what I was telling you before, like, if you know about the cultural context of the writer, that helps you understand the book better, right? But he's trying to determine it a little bit more than is really possible for us to determine. But he came up with some theories which weren't that great, but a lot of his methods, they are still influential, I would say. But he argued that most of the Psalms are written in the temple period. When we would argue that, or most of us would argue that most of the Psalms are written by David, so before the temple, and that and I would argue that many Psalms are written like after the temple was destroyed, after they came back, and then the second temple period, what they call it. There's the first temple period and then the second temple period, right? So I would argue that many of the Psalms were written in that period. But this guy would say that almost all of them were written in the temple, in the first temple. Did I have this slide twice or something? What happened here? FC, Bible derived for short oral compositions. But later form criticism would focus on the present text more than they used to. So it does remain a valuable method for us today. Okay. And then, okay, so that was the early 20th century. Now then there was the war. And then after the war, now we have some other kind of thinking happen, right? Because first of all, the war changed a lot of the way people thought all over academia and all over the world. Like the way people thought about life and stuff, it just totally changed. There was this optimism behind, like, as people in the 19th century, there was like this explosion of science and wealth. At least for the rich people, they were becoming very wealthy, and also they were getting all this technology, and they were thinking of the world in a different way, right? The scientific way, like the evolutionary way, and also whatever. They had all kinds of new ideas, but it led to this idea that, oh well, human beings, like I was saying to you about the progressivism or the developmentalism, they're progressing. History is progressing, and we're just getting better and better. We're just going to go on and go to this huge, like grow up into these amazing society. It's just going to get better and better. They had that idea. What they didn't realize is how their technology and the other things that they're changing the world with, how that could be turned to evil. Let's put it that way. They didn't realize that, yes, society is advancing and it's very good in some ways, but it also gives us human beings the ability to do evil much better than we used to be able to, So they'll, for example, in World War I, it's the first war, maybe the first war. You might say the Civil War in America was the first, but World War I is the first war where you have kind of an industrial scale war where they have industrial methods and things to make weapons and to make war. So it's literally like they have manufacturing and all these kind of factories and all this stuff is set up to do war. And so when mass manufacturing and mass like production is turned to the task of killing other human beings, it's really bad, right? It gets really, really bad, really fast, really ugly, right? And so they weren't aware. They didn't kind of anticipate that yet until World War I. That's when they were like, wow, now we can see where all this technology, it's good, it's great, technology is great, but there's a dark side to it, right? And they didn't see that until then. Anyway, so there was this reaction then now, right? So the hegemony of science is like, that means science at the time, at least in the 19th century, was kind of the ruling. It was like the only way you could determine truth was through science. Any other way of determining truth is just superstitious nonsense. Okay, so that's how they saw it. But after World War I, there was this big reaction to that. People were like, wait a minute, maybe there's some other things we need to think about here. But a lot of the thought, it didn't go to God back. Some of it did, but a lot of it turned to existentialism. That's the idea that, like, it's a philosophy idea, right? It's a philosophical idea where they don't think about God too much. Existentialists, the philosophers of it. But what they'll say is that there's this human experience in our existence, and we're trying to get to this kind of authentic human experience. Authentic. That was a big thing for them. So there's an inauthentic experience of the human life where you're not really living your true human self, your true calling or whatever. And then so their goal is to get to the authentic thing, the true thing, And anyway, that philosophy influenced theology quite a bit. And one of the big figures was Karl Barth. Okay, he critiqued liberal theology, the idea that the Bible is not authoritative, but that it's just a book that we need to use reason to figure out what it really means and stuff. He was against that. He was like, no. The Bible is the Bible. It's the authority. What it says is true. But we need to figure it out using like this existentialist idea. Like it's almost like the Bible. It's the Bible's talking to you in your life it's saying something to you personally that you need to establish, like your authentic experience of what you just read, and live that out. It's like, it's very, I mean, it sounds dumb to us now, but at the time they thought it was a good idea. Anyway, and then after Barth, there was this guy Boltzmann, and he's kind of even more influential than Barth, but he was more kind of, he wasn't like Barth. Like Barth is more like the Bible is true. He accepts the authority of the Bible, and that's why he's been Barth is very influential among, this guy Barth is very influential among like Calvinists and the Reformed Church and people like that. Okay, and then this guy, he's more thinking of it like the Bible is not true necessarily, but there's truth in it that we can get out of it and apply it to our lives theologically and stuff like that. Yeah, I know, it's true. Trauma, dude. So what was I writing here? As Kierkegaard is to Barth, so Heidegger to Boltzmann. Yeah, okay. So Kierkegaard was one of the early existentialists. When we talk about that existentialism philosophy, that's sorry, hang on. What's going on here? When we talk about this existentialism thing, Kierkegaard is one of the first thinkers in that. He was a Christian too, but he wasn't like, he's very influential today as well. But he thought of it like, he didn't think of the Bible as necessarily true either. And he thought of it as like, you have to take this leap of faith to believe in it. It's like, it's not like a rational idea. The believing in the Bible is not rational to Kierkegaard, right? It's like, you have to take this leap of faith. No, logic cannot bring you to the idea that the Bible is true. It has to be this leap of faith, and then you're in the faith now, and then you can live it out. You can live out this authentic Christian experience. Okay, that was Kierkegaard. And then the other guy was Heidegger. Or Heidegger was later, like Heidegger's like 20th century, right? But he was very influential for this guy Boltzmann. And then this guy Heidegger was a Nazi too, by the way, I think. But anyway, so Boltzmann was influenced by Heidegger, and he applied form criticism, which is the thing where they look at the forms, like the form of the text. Okay, so this is like a psalm. So what's the form? This form is a psalm, you know? Or so like, so I have some notes here. Okay, so form criticism. So when Gunkel, he was the OT scholar, right? So when he looked at it with the form criticism idea, he would say, okay, the Psalms, there's different kinds of Psalms. Some Psalms are focused on like lamenting. They call them lament Psalms, right? So they're lamenting their tragic circumstances to God and crying about it to God and asking for help. That's the lament Psalm. Then they have another type of Psalm, they'll call it like the royal Psalm, where they talk about the king and how the king is under God and stuff. So he categorized all the Psalms like that. So Boltzmann, he took that kind of methodology and applied it to the New Testament. And so he would look at the stories in the New Testament and put categories on them. Like this is a miracle story. This is like another kind of pericope, you know. So different passages, like short passages in the Bible, are called pericopes. Okay, pericope, that's this word. It looks like pericopes, but it's pericopes. Anyway, but Boltzmann definitely did not believe that the Bible was historically accurate. There were parts of it that were accurate, but not all of it. So he called for this idea of rediscovering the Jesus of history. There's a Jesus of history, and there's a Christ of faith, which we read about in the Bible. So the Bible, Christ in his mind was not the same Jesus as the Jesus of history. So he would try to research and find the true Jesus in his mind, right? But then you had these guys like Todd, Manson, and Taylor. They kind of reacted to Bultmann's ideas, and they push back on it. Okay. So continuing on Bultmann. Bultmann is very influential, all right? So a lot of his thought was to demythologize the Bible, okay? So in his mind, anytime you see a miracle in the Bible or anything like that, any kind of miraculous supernatural thing in the Bible is just not true, because science is true in his mind, right? So when you look in the Bible now and you see those type of things, you have to use your reason to figure out what's it really saying to me. That's not whatever that's in that book. That's not the truth, because that's just weird. It's not scientific. It's a myth. So what is it really trying to say? So there's this kerygma, means like the preaching or something like that, right, in Greek. But so there's this message of the book behind the story. So you look at the Adam and Eve story, obviously he wouldn't believe that, right? But he would say, okay, there's some kind of deeper message there from God for us that we can learn from this thing, you know? So while he probably believed in evolution and stuff, right? He would say that, okay, the Adam and Eve story tells us that, okay, look, God put a man and a woman. That means that it's men and women, only men and women should marry. That's what God's trying to tell us. Stuff like that. That's how they interpret it. But it's not as if in their mind it's never really happened. That story never actually occurred, okay? It's just a story that God put there, or the Hebrews put it there for us to learn lessons. And also a big sort of push that he had, which is also I would say is a very good thing, and also still influences us a lot, is this idea to make the Bible relevant to modern life, modern society. And obviously he knows this science had undermined the faith of many Christians, so he wanted to say that no, the Bible can be true and you can believe in science. It's just that science is telling you one way of understanding the world, and the Bible's telling you another way of understanding the world. Both are true, but you have to be able to distinguish, and he was trying to propose different ways to distinguish. So these stories like miracles, the three heavens worldview of the Bible, or Jesus ascending to heaven and descending, and those type of things, he thought that was just all mythological, and so it's all just like a symbolic or allegorical lesson it's trying to give us. It's not the truth. And yeah, he had this existentialist hermeneutic, right? So they don't focus on the historical literal meaning of it because they don't believe that, right? So it's the idea is like, what is your response to it? And your response is almost as meaningful as the text itself. So if you read the story of Adam and Eve and it affects you in a certain way to think something about men and women, or something about how humans are, or something, right? That response is more important than what the text actually says, because the text, what it's telling you, is not true. That story is not true in their mind, right? So that's why they think like that. And also they had this idea that the Bible is actually like, it's speaking to you now. It's not like the Bible is written to those people back then, and then we have to. This is what we do nowadays. We'll say that the Bible is written by ancient people to other ancient people, and we have to figure out what the author was saying to his audience. And then once you figure out that, that's the meaning of the book. That's the meaning of the text. And then you take that meaning and apply that to our life today, right? That's what we do. But they would say, no. The historical meaning is not even real. It's completely mythological, right? So then what they're saying is that the Bible is written in such a way that the individual reading it, their response is more important than what it actually says. Do you know what I mean? I don't know if that makes any sense. It doesn't really make a lot of sense if you think about it, but it's a way that they had to think of it. And so, yeah, they had this emphasis on your engagement. Your engagement with the text is more important than what the text actually says, if that makes any sense. It's kind of weird, but I know. And so it allowed for info in the Bible. So information such as, okay, Jesus was crucified by Pilate, you know, that type of thing. That's like, okay, that's probably legit. They would argue, but they would say there's something like pre-scientific type of stuff, like when they say that there was a global flood or whatever. I don't like to say global, but a worldwide flood, or like, you know, a talking donkey or miracles, right? They would just say that that's not true. So in that sense, and with this whole idea of the existentialist idea, that's almost like a subjective way of reading the Bible, right? You're not saying that there's this objective meaning that the Bible has, that no matter who you are, it means the same thing. They're not saying that. They're saying that your response to it, the way it makes you feel, the way it makes you, what makes you think about the world, that's more important than what it actually says. That's their idea. Okay. And so the existentialist problem is to have an authentic Christian life, right? Or an authentic life, right? And then for the Christian existentialist, it's the authentic Christian life. So in their mind, they're saying like, okay, you take the Bible, what it says, and you apply it to your life to have this authentic Christian life, and so that's how you're supposed. That's what you're looking for in the book. You're looking for how the Bible sheds light on the human condition, so-called the human condition, and then apply that to your life. But also with that whole theory of like the fact that it's not real, so it's to figure out why did they write. Like it's very complicated, right? But the important thing is that they almost make it into this subjective thing where it's like what you think about what it means, your response to it is more important than what's actually on the page. Okay, which is, I think, very strange. But see how it says here? Oh, this is my note. Subjective existentialist reading divorced from the historical context, because they thought a lot of the historical context is just mythology anyway. You know, a lot of these guys didn't even believe in like the kingdom of David and Solomon and stuff. They didn't believe that. They thought it was all just mythology. And then you had this thing, neo-orthodoxy, or what they sometimes will call dialectical theology, right? So dialectics is kind of, there's different ways of thinking about it, but sometimes they think of it as two opposite things coming together, and then when they come together, or they're fighting all the time, right? Then eventually they kind of synthesize into this new thing, and then that's the new thing going forward, the new kind of paradigm or whatever you want to say, right? That's one side of dialectics. And then there's another side of dialectics, which is kind of like the Socratic method kind of thing, where it's just like it's a similar idea, but it's like I'll ask, or you and I are talking and we're thinking about things. You have your opinion, and I have my opinion. And when we talk and discuss and we find out, okay, you're wrong about this, but I'm wrong about this, and we can come together and form a new theory, and then we both agree, that's now become the truth. That's dialectics. That's another way of thinking of dialectics. Okay. Anyway, so they have these basic metaphysical assumptions. Okay, God is a subject, not an object. So he's not like I don't know, a god, this thing out there that he has certain properties and certain things that we can determine by reading the Bible. But he is this person who you can talk to. He's a thou. He's a personality who you can communicate with, like through prayer and stuff. But they don't believe that he's like got these properties like omniscience and stuff like that we could just read in the Bible. Okay, it says this about him. Okay, so then that's what God is. God has this property. He has this quality, yeah. And so in their mind, you can't really know him from the Bible, right? Because they don't really believe that there's theological principle, like theological truths in the Bible that we could just, this is a factual thing about God and we believe it now. They don't have that view of the book, right? So they're in their mind, the only way to really know God is through this personal encounter. So when you have your religious experience where you you come to believe in Jesus, and now you're a Christian, right? That's how you can know God. And those type of encounters, those type of experiences in your life, that's how you can know God, And you can read the Bible, and you can pray and stuff, and those things are helpful in your personal relationship. But but you can only know him through this personal encounter, not by reading the Bible, not by other things like that. And then they had this idea, divide between God's transcendence and fallen humanity. Which is something we also believe as well, right? Like God's perfect, holy, and good, right? So, and then we're like, sinful creatures. So there's this gap between us and him, right? And so when they saw these mythological stories, which they also have the scientific worldview, right? So they think those stories are all myths. So they think the mythological stories are meant to bridge the gap, because there's this difference between humanity and God. And there's something we can't understand about him. It's like too far beyond us. So he wrote these stories as a way to communicate his truth to us, because we're too beneath him to fully understand what he's trying to say. So we have to interpret these myths to understand what he's trying to tell us. And so, yeah, right. So they're telling us theological truth in the stories of the book, but the book makes it seem like it's history, but it's not. It's not history, right? The book is not history. Adam and Eve did not happen, but it's telling us some theological truths about God that we can kind of draw out of the story by interpretation, okay? And also they had to say the truth is paradoxical. So you see in the book that, for example, Paul will say salvation is by faith alone. And then James will say that faith alone is dead, right? So they see that as a what do you call it? As a contradiction, right? So then they'll just say that we'll explain that, right? We'll say that's not a contradiction. Paul's saying something different than what James is saying. That's what we say. They'll say, no, that happens in the book, because that's how truth is. Truth is not always a cut and dry thing where I can just tell you A is this and A equals A and B equals B. Sometimes A equals B. And so you have to figure it out. There's some kind of, so the paradox idea is that, okay, there's a paradox in that Paul said this and James said this. Paul said faith alone. James said faith alone is dead. How do we fix it? Well, it's a paradox. There's some kind of greater truth. They're conflicting. They are contradicting. They're not. It's like there is a contradiction there. The Bible has a contradiction, but in their mind, they're like, there's some greater truth that so-called contradiction is pointing you to, that you can understand. So maybe some of them will say that, okay, what James is saying is that faith is, he agrees with Paul that faith is, salvation is by faith alone, but that in order to get to the next level, or once you're saved, now you're going to have like good works, that's what they'll come up with, those kind of explanations. Anyway, so they cast out on the idea that the Bible is rational and logical and that it has no contradictions, which is the classical idea, right? But they were against that idea. They said there's contradictions, and we need to figure out what the paradox means. Why is there this contradiction, apparent contradiction? And then, okay, now with this one, the biblical theology movement. Okay. So with these guys, this is a kind of closing in on what we start to think nowadays, but they're against the whole, not against it, but they rejected a lot of the historical critical methods, right? So they more want to look at the whole book as a whole and books of the Bible individually as a whole, right? They don't want to think of it as all written by different sources and how do we figure it out, how do we untangle it all. They don't think of it that way. Think of it as like, okay, it came down, it's one book, it's got one theological message from God for us, and we need to think about that. So their emphases were these. They focus more on the theological aspects. They get away from the sort of existentialist, subjective aspects and go more to what's the theological message here? What is it saying about God, about humanity, about everything, right? And then they also thought of the Bible as one whole document that we need to see as one thing. One piece of literature with one message. Think of it that way, and have a theology which is systematic across the whole book with no contradictions. That's also part of their way of thinking about it, okay? And also, they thought that God was revealing himself in history. That's why the Bible is telling us about history and God's revelation in history. And also, they felt that there was other revelations in human history of God. Oh, and also they would look at this, that the Bible's approach to life, to humanity, and to all kinds of things is different than the Greek approach. There's a Hebrew or Jewish or Hebrew mentality or philosophy that influences the Bible, and that's what the Bible is speaking from. And it's different than the sort of Greek way of thinking about things. And so it's good to recognize that difference in our interpretation. And also they would focus on that, right? Like, remember I was telling you how they started to discover about those ancient cultures around there, like the Mesopotamians and the Egyptians and stuff. They started to learn a lot about them in the 19th century. And so they're like, okay, well, they had this idea that those cultures were influencing the Hebrews and stuff. But what these guys started noticing is, look, there's lots of differences, even though there's lots of similarities between these two myths. Like, let's say the flood myth of the Babylonians versus the flood myth of the Hebrews. There's lots of similarities, but there's also lots of huge differences. And so they started focusing on that and explaining, look at how this is different. Like, it's just the opposite in many ways, Like their God sent the flood because he hated humanity. And he just thought of humanity as a waste of time. But our God loves humanity, and he loves his children, right? Even though he's killing all the humans, people will say, "Oh, it's because he hates them." No, because some of them are going to go to heaven. It's just that he doesn't like hate them. He doesn't want the earth to be like running like that. That's all it was, Anyway, so those are their emphases. And then you had this thing, redaction criticism. So they're taking some of the ideas from source and form criticism and putting it into this new way. So because these guys would often look at the, they don't look at the book. They don't look at the book. Let's say the Pentateuch. They don't look at it as like one whole book. They look at it as, okay, this is written by the Yahweh group, and this is written by the J source. They have all these different groups. They're all theoretical. There's these groups that they thought up in their mind were the ones who wrote it at different periods in Israel's history, and it's all theoretical. That's how they thought of it. But the redaction critics, they'll say, no, wait, let's just look at this whole book as one book and think of it that way. What is this book saying? And like from the beginning to the end, what's the message of this book just by itself? Don't think of all the sources and stuff. How are we supposed to figure all that out? And so when you think of it like that, right, now you can think of it like, okay, what is this author trying to say about the theology here? What is this author saying about God? What's he saying about humanity? What's he saying? You're not trying to think about what are those people with their like some group that you theoretically came up with and try to figure out, okay, what is their motivations? Why would they write this? They'll say stuff like, okay, some of this stuff was written after they got back from Babylon because they wanted to write the story in this way to make the people think that they could have, that God will eventually give them the promised land or something, even though they've been conquered by the Babylonians. So they'll say that, even though the Bible does talk about that, right? But they'll The only reason that's there is because the people want to believe that, or they wanted to tell the people that, not because God really is going to restore the kingdom to Israel, That's the type of thing. Anyway, sorry. This type of thing first emerged in the gospel studies and this type of thinking. And then later they start to apply to the Hebrew Bible. I think it's really good, actually. A lot of it. Not all of it, but. And then, and then the return of the quest for the historical Jesus, because Boltzmann was basically almost denying that the historical Jesus. Not that he didn't believe that there was a historical Jesus, but he felt like almost everything in the Bible about Jesus is wrong. And so his students, many of them were reacting to that. They were like, no, come on, man. So they're trying to figure out what stories in the Bible are true and which ones aren't. So some of them are historical, some of them are not. So they would say, for example, the story that Jesus was crucified, that's clearly historical. They would say. Because why? Because you have 4 different authors of the Bible writing about it, including also Paul and those people. So many authors wrote about it. And also they wrote about it kind of like the actual event, like they would write about that. 4 of the gospel writers all cover that event, right? So they would just say that's like a lot of evidence that it actually happened. So they would say that that's for sure. Other things, they would say, wait a minute. This story only appears in the book of Luke. This one story, like the story when he talks about the, the story of Lazarus and the rich man. That's only in Luke, right? So they'll say, oh, that's probably not true, because he's just telling. Only Luke has it, so probably there's not much evidence for it, and he just made it up. That's their kind of method. And then, by the way, sorry. Because with Boltzmann's way of thinking about the Bible, right? A lot of people accused him and their way of thinking of Docetism. So the idea is that Docetism is this ancient heresy where they would say that Jesus is God, but he's not a man. He's just only God. So when the Boltzmannites were sort of accused of that, they reacted by focusing their historical studies on the crucifixion. And like I say to you, they would, because that's the crucifixion demonstrates his humanity, right? He's not just like a God who took on human form. No, he's a human being who died on a cross, right? That's why. So by focusing on that, they were able to react and kind of discount the idea that they're Docetists. And they would focus more on Christ's teaching than on his deeds, because they don't really believe in miracles that much and stuff, right? So they focus more on what he was teaching. Which of those teachings are historical? If a teaching appears in more than one of the gospel accounts, then it's considered to be more historically reliable than another teaching, and those type of things, okay? But they did narrow the gap. So whereas Boltzmann's idea of the historical Christ and the Christ of faith was very far apart, these guys kind of brought it closer together. Not uniting it yet, but closer. And then you have this thing, the new hermeneutic. This is another kind of thing that post-war hermeneutics came up with, okay? So in this way of thinking, it's kind of a weird way. Like, okay, so what they're saying is that the book, when you see the book, it's not just a book with writing on it, that you read it and then you come up with you interpret it. That's not what's happening. It's like every time we speak, every type of language act or language event, it's like that thing has a unique truth in it, So when you read the book, there's a unique encounter there with the book, okay? Like, it's not like any other time anybody else ever read the book. Your encounter with the book is unique to you in your life, your like way of seeing truth or whatever. And so your experience is the kind of important determining factor for what the book means, okay? In this way of thinking. So when read, the text creates a new language event. The biblical text interprets the reader. You see, the reader doesn't interpret the text. The text interprets the reader. That's what they're saying. That's what their argument is, okay? And then so you're being confronted with God's word, and you just have to react. How you respond to that is the meaning. Your response to the text is the meaning more than the text itself. If that makes any sense. I don't know. It's very strange way of thinking for us now when we think of this, but there are people who still kind of hold to this way of thinking. So the text, it's not the interpreter that's making the interpretation, it's the text that's guiding you. Okay. And so, and also the idea, and this is also very good that we still use this today. This is kind of like the way of thinking today. The text intentions is more important, not your questions. It's like the text has an intent, yeah? And so we don't really think of it that way, but we'll think of it like the author's intent. The author's intent is more important than your personal questions about what the Bible means. It's really, what is the author trying to say? That's what we're trying to figure out here, right? So in that sense, they still have their legacy with us today, but there's still a lot of their thinking is very strange to us. Oh, look, I forgot about this slide, but anyway, so some of the positive contributions was that it stimulated theological reflection on hermeneutics, because people hadn't really had this kind of deep thought about it in a long time, where they really were considering these methods and how are we doing this, and is this the right way? And so by bringing the focus back to the methods and of hermeneutics and stuff, it was good. It was beneficial, But they have this idea of the multidimensional relationship between the reader and the text. That is still influential today. And it is true in a sense. Like you need to be aware of how, I don't agree that the text is interpreting the reader, but I do think that you have to be aware of the influence the text has on you in your interpretation. You have to be aware of that. If you're not aware of it, then you're not going to interpret it properly. You have to be able to kind of see through your own prejudices and not allow those things to affect you, right? And that's something that by increasing our awareness of that, they were beneficial to our methods today. And also, they observe the effects. The effects of the text on the reader, right? So previously, the thought was that the reader is the only one interpreting, and the text is just completely passive. And here, now they're saying, no, the reader has to think about, how is the text affecting you? And is that affecting your interpretation? You have to ask that question. If you don't ask that question, you're not going to interpret it properly, So they're the ones that kind of came up with that way of thinking about it. And also they had this idea that the scripture should relate to your real life, to your life. It should be practical in your life, not just some abstract thing that you're just thinking about out in the world. So you want to get the original meaning of the text, but you also want to relate that to the contemporary life, right? Which is very key to the way we interpret the Bible today. Some of the weaknesses of there. Oh, I'm sorry. Is it getting too headachy? I know. It's a lot of history stuff, right? It's very boring. I know. I'm almost done. Some of the weaknesses of this hermeneutic is that you have less of the emphasis on the actual historical meaning of the text is less emphasized, right? In this way of thinking. So they'll try to figure it out to some extent, but they have different ways of doing that. But they have so much emphasis on our response to it that they de-emphasize the actual literal meaning of it, which we today, or at least in my school of thought on this, would be that that's not good. And also, so because of this way of seeing it, right, you're thinking more about your response than what the text actually says. So that limits it to to what is the text actually trying to say to us? What is, like, the text has something it wants to say to us. And if you're just focused on your response to it, you're not looking close enough at what it's actually saying. So in their way of thinking about it, the Bible can tell you about human life and the human condition and kind of abstract thinkings about that, but it can't tell you anything about history, science, culture, or theology, or anything like that. So not that they completely dismissed it, but it wasn't very. They kind of they didn't put too much stock in that. And then you have this new way of thinking called canon criticism, okay, where this is kind of like getting more into the way we think of it now, because they would say that the Bible books are authoritative, and they're just completely authoritative. Everything in it is authoritative and true, and it's from the Bible. And the Hebrews and the Christians, that's what they thought of it as, And so when they compiled the Bible, when they took the different Psalms and made it into the book of Psalms, when they took the different Proverbs and made it into the book of Proverbs, that process was guided by some kind of theological principles, okay? So they had that idea, and they're trying to figure that out now. And I talk a lot about that when we talk about the Psalms and the Proverbs. I'll often talk to you guys about, like, how the order of the Psalms is done in a specific way for a specific purpose. And so we don't necessarily know exactly what that purpose is, but we can think about it and we can try to figure that out. And that enhances our understanding of the book, right? And so that's from these guys. That's from this type of thinking. Canon criticism. So the meaning of text is found in, so the book of Psalms, for instance, it's not just a book of individual Psalms. There's a meaning to be found in the canon of the Psalms, like all the Psalms together. There's some kind of additional meaning or lesson there for us that we need to kind of look for, okay? Oh, and then another thing that happened was that these Pentecostals, they became quite influential in scholarship, right? And so their hermeneutics became more influential as well. So you have this idea of charismatic issues, such as, like, they have a lot of focus on their experience, right? Their religious experience, their spiritual, their experience of the gifts of the Spirit and things like that. They ask the question, how does that affect our hermeneutics? How does that affect how we study the Bible? And so their view of it is very different than most other Christians, And also they do have to ask this question now. So is the authority of the Bible or the ministry of the Holy Spirit in your life? When the Spirit tells you something, you hear the voice of God in your head. Which is more important? Is it the Bible or is it the voice in your head? So there's a debate there that never existed before. Nowadays, most of these charismatics will say, of course, the Bible is supreme. And so if your voice in your head ever told you something that contradicts the Bible, then you should believe the Bible, and the voice in your head is probably you're crazy or something or whatever. But what if the voice in your head doesn't contradict the Bible? But it's not saying anything. It's just saying something. It's just like, the voice in your head is telling you to go eat a hamburger. That doesn't contradict the Bible, right? But it might, in the sense that we probably shouldn't think of ourselves as being able to hear God's voice. But they don't think about that part, right? But anyway, so that's what your theology affects your hermeneutics as well. If you're a charismatic, that's a different hermeneutic. It's a different way of understanding the Bible. They're not going to understand it the same way. And then, sorry, my voice is going. Then you have this third quest for the historical Jesus. That's like, basically, people started to find these new things. Like there was a lot of new information in archaeology from first century Palestine. There was new methods in archaeology and in biblical interpretation. And also they found a lot of new manuscripts, such as the Gospel of Thomas, the Dead Sea Scrolls, and those things. So they all affected our understanding of Jesus' life and his death. And so they would try to figure out the real historical Jesus again, as if like they don't believe it's the exact same thing as the Bible. So they're trying to figure out, there's a historical Jesus. What's the deal with that? What's in the Bible? What's not? These guys came. Then there was this thing called the Jesus Seminar, which is pretty influential too. This is not like post-war. This is like 70s or like late 70s, early 80s. Okay, but these guys started talking about their methods for how do we figure out what's actually true in the Jesus stories and what isn't, right? So it's just like it's just similar to the previous historical Jesus quest, right? But it's like another version of it. But their ideas are very controversial and not well regarded by most evangelicals. Continued interest and developments. What's this saying here? Anyway, now we're in the 21st century, okay? So today, and this is the part, like this book, actually, I had this book when I was in school, right? But this is the new edition that I'm using for this course. So it's got some stuff that I didn't have back then. But anyway, so you have new methods and reinventions of old methods. And I'll talk to you about that. Literary criticism. So this is kind of a new idea where they look at the Bible as a piece of literature. So if you take I don't know if you ever took an English class or anything like in literature, when they study like a book like Shakespeare or whatever, you look at, okay, what are the characters saying to each other? What's the plot, right? If you're looking at a narrative, right? If you're looking at a narrative like the Gospels, you say, what's the plot? Who are the characters? What's the conflict? Which characters are in conflict? And those type of questions, those are more literary questions that we might ask when we read a novel or something, or we read Shakespeare. But you can ask that of the Bible too. And it's a way of understanding the Bible that has its own, it can reveal its own things, so there's some value in that too. And also they brought in more cross-discipline stuff. So they'll bring in like sociologists to talk about how, sociologists will talk to you about how, oh, you know what, in ancient Palestine, they had like a culture of tribal culture, and it was patriarchal, and they had this type of legal systems and those things. So they'll talk about those things. They'll talk about how back then it was like an honor shame culture. Today we have more of a guilt culture. Okay, so that's a sociological thing that can help us. It can shed light on the Bible, right? So that they use those type of things. And the perspectival approach. This is like, it's from this philosophy by Nietzsche called perspectivism. It's like everybody has their own perspective. There's no universal truth. Your truth is based on your perspective. Okay, so if you believe in, like, if you're like a German woman, right? Your perspective is different than an English man, right? So your truth is different then based on that. You have there's a truth of the German woman versus the truth of the English man. And so from this approach to the Bible, now you have different perspectives on what does the Bible mean. There's a liberationist, that's like kind of like almost like communist revolutionary type of approach. And then you have ethnic, so different ethnic groups, their sort of approach and their perspective, right? Then you have there's a kind of global perspective that they call it. Okay. And then there's a post-colonial idea, which is like they talk about the different ways that people in the post-colonial societies, how they think about things, and their perspective is different too. So a country such as, I don't know, such as Russia, right? They're not, they have a different, they're not post-colonial. There was no way, no one ever colonized them, you know? Whereas my parents' country, Guyana, they're post-colonial. They used to be a colony of England, right? So now their perspective is different than the Russian perspective from that regard. So then they could talk about that. And then they came up with this queer hermeneutics. This is an actual thing. I didn't even know this, but there's actual professors who are queer hermeneutics professors. This is a real thing. I didn't even know this, man. But anyway, this is a thing. And they've got more and more literature coming out all the time. So that's sad. Anyway. And then you have this thing called intertextuality studies. So within the Bible, there's different books. Sometimes you'll have one book is quoting another book. Paul will quote Proverbs. He'll quote Deuteronomy. So it's like, what's going on here? First of all, we have to ask the question. Is the later text, is it quoting, or is it just alluding to it? Or is it just sort of echoing it? You know, there's that question, right? Echoing, like, so an allusion would be like, I'm not quoting it, but I say something that you know, if you read that other book, you know that story. So when I say this thing, I'm alluding to it. I'm like telling you, I'm hearkening you back to that thing so you can remember it and think about what I'm telling you now. That's an allusion, right? Which is different than a quote, right? A quote would be like I'm taking a literal what it says, putting it in my thing, and using that to make my argument. An allusion is different than that. And then there's also this thing called an echo, where it's not an allusion. I'm not really alluding to it. I'm not pointing this thing out as part of my argument. I'm just saying something which is also said in that other thing, where probably I'm just like saying it because it's so influential to me. That earlier thing influenced me so much that I say it now. Or maybe just that I'm just, so there's different ways of understanding intertextuality. But intertextuality is just this idea that the different books of the Bible are connected. They talk about each other. There's this conversation going on between the different books of the Bible. And so we can study that. And also, yeah, so if Paul quotes Deuteronomy, does that affect our interpretation of the original Deuteronomy text, or should it not, or what? Because sometimes Paul will say something and it's like, oh, well, okay, so that means that's like a prophecy then, Or you might say, wait. Paul's he's not saying that. He's just saying that there's this principle there. Like when he quotes the thing that about thou shalt not muzzle the ox, that thresheth out the corn, right? So the ox, he uses that principle, which is about oxen. He's saying the Deuteronomy law says don't muzzle the ox when he's threshing the corn. And then Paul takes that and says, look what it says, don't muzzle the ox. So in a similar way, if you have a preacher who's preaching the word of God, give him some money. Don't just make him starve, he needs to have money to do this work. So he took that principle and he applied it to the modern, or to his period. So that's like another way of understanding the intertextuality. There's different ways of understanding. Anyways, many ways of seeing it. So in this way, cross-referencing. So, okay, so that book says this and this book says this, and referencing it back, that becomes this important aspect of biblical interpretation again, where it wasn't for a long time. They didn't do too much of that. They did it back in the ancient days with the rabbis. The Jews would do it. But most of the Christians didn't do it until it's become very, very prominent now. And then also, yeah, this is a different way. So by using this way of thinking of it, it gives us a different way of thinking of the older text as well. So first we look at the new text and we say, okay, this text is quoting from this text. That's interesting. Let's see, how does this make us understand this text? It also makes us understand the older text in a different way, How do I identify intertextuality? So this is the question they ask, right? How do I identify it? How do I identify that this book is actually influenced by this other book? Is that true, or are we just thinking that? Is that really what that is, or is that just the thing in our head? So first you have to do that, figure it out. And what's the difference between echoes and illusions? Like I was saying to you, there's an illusion. There's like, I'm pointing out this similarity between this thing now and this thing in this other book, so that you can. So it's part of my argument. And I'm making an argument, and I'm saying, look at this other book, how they said this thing, and then it helps me to make my argument. Like when Paul was saying about the muzzle of the ox, right? He's actually alluding to that, or he quoted. That's a quotation. That's a little bit different, but anyway, there's illusions and there's echoes. The illusions is when you point to this thing from the other book, and it's like part of your argument. The echoes is more like it's just a thing that happened to be there in your writing, probably because that older book influenced you, but you're not really using it as part of your argument. You're just putting it there. That's an echo. It's different. Anyway, which of these are intentional? Which of these are accidental? We have to figure that out, right? Sometimes it might just be accidental. There's no more meaning for us. But if it's intentional, then that means the author's is part of the meaning of the text. So it's part of our interpretation. And also, it's also going to affect our interpretation of the older text. And also, is this intertextuality a product of the original writer who maybe he's prophesying something? And so the later writer is just telling us about this thing that the original writer told us already? Or is it the later writer is giving you this new way of understanding the older writer? So I think we talked about in Matthew 2 how he says about there's a couple of things there, but one thing he says is like, out of Egypt I've called my son. And he's referring to the fact that Jesus was called out of Egypt because he told Joseph to go back home. Because when Herod tried to kill all the babies in Bethlehem, Joseph fled with Mary and Jesus to Egypt. And then later on, when Herod died, God called Joseph out of Egypt and Joseph returned, right? And so Matthew says, out of Egypt I've called my son. And then if you look at where he got that quote is from Hosea chapter 4, I believe. And then in Hosea, when he says it, he's not talking about Jesus. He's talking about the Jews, the Hebrews, right? He's saying, out of Egypt I've called my son, because God actually refers to Israel as his firstborn, in Exodus chapter 4, I think. And so that's actually a different thing, So the later writer is actually giving a new meaning to the older text, right? So that's different than just quoting it or something like that, right? So that's part of your intertextuality studies as well. And then you have this thing, reception history. Okay, so this thing is like, okay, so we look at like, how have the books of the Bible affected the cultures where they are received? So, is there an impression, or does it make a difference in terms of art, music, poetry, etc.? And we can see that it has, right? So we can look at that and study that. So the question for these guys is not so much what does the text mean, as what does this text do? What can this text do? Yeah. So this way of thinking about it can help us to improve our understanding of the book, but we need to remember that it's before the book was ever received by us. It was a content in God's mind or in the author's mind, and so that's the meaning. That's still the ultimate authority, But for these guys, it's not. But we need to remember that. And he has some other developments like this. So Pentecostal hermeneutics has become quite influential now. There's a lot of scholars, a lot of writers. It's quite big. And so these are some of the big names. Amos Jong and J.K.A. Smith. And then canon criticism has advanced. It started off with Beveridge Childs, who's a very influential scholar of the 20th century. And there's still some controversy about the method, but it's been influential. And then, inductive Bible study. So this was a thing that it came back because higher criticism is the idea that they can like kind of figure out which are the sources of the Bible and all those type of things, but they try to figure out those things. That's what they call higher criticism. Okay, and the reaction to it was this idea, inductive Bible study. So in inductive, you just forget about everything you know. Just get it out of your head. Look at the book, look what it says, and that's what you're gonna base it on. You study exactly what's on the page. And oh, thank you, brother. God bless. I'm glad you like it. So Liliana's got a headache. You should send her some Tylenol, bro. Anyway, but thanks so much for your support, my brother. Anyway, so inductive is very influential even today, right? But it began as this reaction to that kind of criticism way of thinking. And so this Ashbury Seminary, this is the place where they had the Ashbury revival last year or a few years ago. They had the big revival thing on the campus. So, which is this seminary is quite influential too. They have a lot of big name scholars there, but so they have the whole inductive study like courses and department and stuff, right? So it's quite well regarded now, and they have a journal, the Journal of Inductive Study, and so inductive study is good for the student of the Bible, or the lay person, or the preacher, or anyone who's got training. It's something that anyone can use. It was very good. And then this thing came back a little bit, like it's a theological interpretation. That is there's biblical studies and then there's theology. Okay, there's kind of two different branches. They're not the same thing. Biblical studies, they'll study the book and they'll also study different books individually. So they're more focused on what does this author trying to say to his audience. So they look at the book of Romans. They're just trying to figure out what is Paul trying to say to the Roman church. That's all they're concerned with. But the theologian, when they study the book of Romans, they're trying to figure out how does this fit with all the other books of the Bible? And how can we have a theology of the Bible that takes into account every single thing written in the whole book, right? So that way of thinking about it was kind of falling away or falling out of favor because of so much of the critical way of thinking about it, right? But this has come back now, and people are more trying to understand the Bible as a whole, as a book from God that's telling us certain things that it's true. That's just true. It's not just like different authors telling us different things. It's one book from God. He used the authors to say different things, and yes, each of those authors speaks as individual humans in their own voice, but it's still all from God. That's the thing. That's what the theologian or theological interpretation would emphasize. And also they use, by the way, they go back to a lot of the pre-critical interpreters. That is the critical methods of those people, mostly that started in the 19th century. When those things got popular, people stopped looking at older ways of thinking about the Bible. They just stopped paying attention to it because they were like, those old interpreters, they don't have a clue. We're the ones that have all the methods. But now these guys now in the 21st century, now they're going back and looking at like, okay, let's think about what like the church fathers thought. Let's think about like what the Jews of the first century thought about the Old Testament. Let's think about what the reformers thought, like Martin Luther or Calvin or something. So they'll read those writers and they'll think about that and also add that into their interpretation. which is something that had fallen out of favor, but they're bringing it back. Oh, you know what's funny? Because the original book, right? When I took this course, I took it with this guy. This guy, William Webb, he was my professor. And then now I have the new version of the book, right? So they mention this guy because his kind of method is very influential, even in America and stuff. So, or around the world now. So anyway, so William Webb, he's a nice guy. I disagree with him, but he's a nice guy. So he wants to distinguish. His main thing is distinguishing between the things in the Bible that are timeless, that are just, they're true no matter what period you live in. And then there's other things in the Bible which are true for the cultural moment that they were written in, and they're no longer true today. Okay? So one of the examples that he would bring up is complementarian, like complementarianism, like the idea that women shouldn't teach, it's First Timothy and stuff like that. Like, he'll say, William Webb will say that was just something that they had in their time. Like God needed to do that. He needed to say that to those people back then because of the cultural moment that they were in. If God said to them that women could teach, then people would be like, what kind of thing is this? I don't even want to go to this church. So God couldn't do it at that time. People weren't ready. But now, in the modern era, people are ready for this. So now we can let women teach because now we've got feminism, we understand, and God can do that. God changes the way he deals with people over time with things like that. And so what he's saying is true. I don't agree with him on the complementarianism thing. Even the way he uses this model to explain like slavery. Why is slavery permitted in the Bible back in the day and no longer? And some of what he's saying in that regard is kind of useful. I disagree with him on that too. We used to get in big fights, me and this guy, but I really love him. We're cool. We're cool. We didn't fight that much, but we used to get in some kind of arguments and stuff. But anyway, he's cool. I like him. Anyway, hermeneutic of transformation. This is like, okay, so this is the idea that just interpreting the Bible, just what it says to you, is not enough. You must actually figure out how this thing applies to our life. And if you don't do that, you haven't completed the task of the hermeneutics. You haven't completed your interpretation task unless you figure out how this thing, whatever you figured out what it means, how does that apply today to our life? So they use a lot of, they focus on self-knowledge and self-criticism as a way of, like, you need to be able to understand how is your prejudices and your way of thinking affecting your interpretation, and your weaknesses, your personal flaws. How does that affect how you interpret the book? You have to make sure you're aware of that, otherwise you won't understand it, right? Which is true. So there's a lot of value in what these people are saying. I don't agree with everything they're saying, but there is a lot of insight in what they're saying too. And also he would say that you don't want to be like this individual reading the book on your own. He's pushing back on the idea of the existentialist, where they try to say it's like you're thinking about it, or your thinking is more important than the book's actual words. He's saying no, that's not it. Everybody has the same meaning. Whatever it means, that's what it means, and it means the same thing for everybody. So we need to have this kind of solidarity with other Bible readers, and we can all come together and find the truth of it. We're all basically the same, trying to figure out what this book says. Let's get together. Let's do this as a group. Let's figure this out. So that's part of what he's trying to say. Oh yeah, and then this is the thing, man. Anyway, so these guys, they try to do this thing where they I don't know, they bring back these old methods that they're not even like methods. It's weird. Like this thing, for example, Lectio Divina is an ancient method of the Catholics. Okay, they would like the Jesuits. They came up with this. What they'll do is they'll take a text, like a book of like a whatever, like some biblical text, and instead of just trying to figure out what it means, before you try to figure out what it means with the actual analysis, right? What you're just going to do is just read it again and again and again. Read it again and again and again. Then pray about it. Then there's some other methods that they have, but there's a step-by-step process. But it's not like any kind of logical thing, right? It's like read it, and then pray about it, and then let the text kind of speak to you. And so it's to me it's superstitious, and I don't like it. And I was actually the seminary I went to, they made me take this course, and I still resent them to this day that I had to take this course. But it's good in the sense that I learned about it, so I know how to critique these people. But like, it's not good, man, in my opinion. And they bring back stuff like this other stuff, like praying to icons and things like that. They think they try to find the value in that and try to bring it back. But in terms of hermeneutics, the big thing is stuff like Lectio Divina and those kind of methods where they'll just pray on the thing or something. Oh, sorry, you gotta go to sleep. I'm sorry. I hope I'm not putting you to sleep. I'm almost done, but yeah, I'll be back. I know. I'm sorry, Liliana. I'm putting her to sleep, man. Anyway, interaction between objective and subjective dimensions of interpretation. So they'll say there's this like there's an objective side where like what we do, where we actually study what it means, and there's this meaning that everyone is going to come to the same meaning. There's one meaning for everyone, right? Then there's also this subjective thing, like in your head. So like where you just read it again and again, and then let the scripture speak to you, let God like kind of influence you. That's what they're trying to do, which is mysticism, in my opinion. Okay, and I don't think it's very good. I think it's very bad, actually. This is a Jesuit method. This one, Lectio Divina, but they have other methods that are similar. But anyway, I don't support this type of thing. But there may be some value here. I'm not going to just throw it out, but I do think mostly it's bad. And that's it. That's the slideshow, guys. So that is the history of interpretation, or at least what we're going to cover in this course, okay? So I hope that wasn't too boring. I know that was a lot, and believe me, even just saying all that was boring for me. But now, all right, we got through the history part. So now we can get into some other more methodological stuff, so it'll be better now. Or at least it won't be that boring. But anyway, so thanks so much, you guys. Thanks for coming by, and yeah, I'll be back in a couple hour, 2.5 hours, and we'll have the live. Okay. All right. So thanks for watching Toronto Bible Study. Where's my thing? Oh wait. Hallelujah.
Okay. I'm studying the Bible in Toronto. 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 Studying the Bible with Mike, Sam, Pat. These other YouTubers are just so trash. Hit the thumbs up if you want to support. Go follow Mike as he follows the Lord. I'm studying the Bible in Toronto. 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 You better watch out, Mike's calling out the shills. If you're not free grace, you need to sit down and chill. We're not hyper grace, you know we keep it real. Eternally secure, you know that we're sealed. We don't back low, we're not workspace heretics. Mike's not in it for the money, trying to get a lick. They out here selling their souls for a couple clicks. Becoming Freemasons so they can't just get rich. I'm studying the Bible in Toronto. 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 Shout out to Mike, Sam, Pat. Check out his channel, Toronto Bible Study. Subscribe and like.